Welcome, Songs of Hope and Center Home Groups. I'm excited that you've joined us today. We're continuing our series on Nehemiah. And a few announcements to start with. This Friday, Jacob and I will have our next edition of our Generational Faith podcast. We hope that you'll tune in. It'll be on YouTube and anywhere you find your podcasts. Plus, our next big event is our trunk or treat that we do every year with hundreds and hundreds of people from our community on Sunday, October 20th. We'd love for you to be a part of that. Please let me know, let us know as a church. Contact us through social media or in person. We also, if you're not able to make it, we are also collecting candy, and any candy that you bring into church, just put it in the copy room, which is Cheryl's old office right inside of the east doors. And then lastly, we were doing just something a little bit new with our questioning today. We're going to ask questions, actually some reflective questions during the actual talk today, and we're going to give you a chance, if you'd like to pause the video and ask the questions while it's fresh in the discussion. You can. If you'd rather wait to the end, that's fine as well. But we'll give you a chance to pause, and you may need to wake up the person beside you, or it'd be a good time just to ask the group, what do you think about this? What's your experiences with this? So hopefully you like our little different transition here. Hope you have a great study. As a child, this person had a great difficulty in speaking and reading due to his dyslexia. His teachers thought he was mentally handicapped and antisocial. One teacher even told his father, no matter what he does, he will never amount to anything. You see, he was forced to take up a job as a clerk in a Swiss patent office, and it seemed the teacher's prophecy was coming true. But in 1905, while still a clerk, he published a paper called The Special Theory of Relativity. The paper became so famous that by 1908, he was considered a leading scientist. And by 1921, he won the Nobel Prize. By the time he died, Albert Einstein became the most famous scientist of all time, and his name became synonymous with the word genius. So what happened to the critics who said he was mentally handicapped and would never amount to anything? Nobody really knows what happened to them, since nobody bothers to remember them. You see, Einstein overcame tons of internal criticism, similar to some of the criticism that Nehemiah received that we've been talking about throughout this series. So in Nehemiah 5 and 6 that we're going to talk about today, we're going to see the trials and the challenges that Nehemiah faces, not only from external enemies, but also from internal conflicts within the group. And these chapters highlight social justice and leadership integrity and resilience in the face of opposition. So let's start in chapter 5. We're going to look at internal conflict and social justice. So we see the start of it, the focus shifts from external threats to internal problems. The chapter teaches key principles on leadership and justice, as well as the importance of community and togetherness. So let's look at the first few chapters. And today what I'm going to do, instead of reading the verses, we can kind of do that on our groups, I'm going to kind of summarize what some of the verses say. So chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, really talk about the outcry of the people. The chapter begins with a great outcry from the people, specifically the poor, because they were being oppressed by their own Jewish brothers. And there were three main complaints here. First of all, there was hunger. You see, families lacked food, and as many were working on the wall, and they couldn't tend to their own fields. Number two, they had debt problems. People had mortgaged their fields and their vineyards and their home just to buy grain during the famine. And lastly, they were worried about slavery. So you see, some were forced to sell their children into slavery just to pay their debt. So they had legitimate complaints to be angry and upset from the internal group there. And then we see Nehemiah's righteous anger in action that's talked to us in verses 6 through 13. You see, when Nehemiah hears the outcry, he becomes angry. The exact verse in verse 6 is, when I heard their outcry of those charges, I was very angry. He wasn't just angry. He was like Incredible Hulk angry. His anger isn't just emotional, though. It's righteous response to the violation of God's laws regarding usury. You see, Nehemiah confronts the nobles and the officials, accusing them of exacting interest from their fellow Jews, something prohibited in the law. We read in Leviticus 25:35, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. You see, he demands they return the fields, vineyards, homes, and interests that they have taken. The nobles and the officials, they agree to restore what they had taken. And the people respond with the public oath, solidifying their commitment. So what do we do? How do we apply that in our lives? See, Nehemiah's leadership shows that righteous anger can lead to justice when properly directed. He doesn't just get angry, but he takes action. You see, as Christians, we are called to confront injustices, but with wisdom and a solution-oriented approach. How can we channel our anger at injustice into constructive actions that lead to change? Next, we see verses 14 through 19 about Nehemiah's example of integrity. Nehemiah then gives a personal example of his own integrity as a leader. And though he was appointed as governor, he refused to burden the people with the governor's tax. Instead, he worked alongside the people and supported others out of his own resources. That's a true servant leader. Nehemiah demonstrates servant leadership, true leaders for the needs of others above their own interests. So how can you, in your sphere of influence, embody servant leadership? So next we get to chapter 6. And here we're looking at external opposition instead of internal, and the completion of the wall. So in chapter 6, Nehemiah faces continued opposition from outside the forces, particularly from Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. We talked about them early on in this book, who try various tactics to undermine and distract him from completing the wall. So in verses 1 through 4, they're looking at dealing with deception and distraction. You see, Sanballat and Geshem repeatedly try to lure Nehemiah into a meeting, but Nehemiah discerns their intentions and he refuses, knowing that they intend to harm him. Nehemiah's response is clear and is focused. He basically says, I'm doing great work here. I cannot come down. You see, he refused to be distracted from the task at hand. You see, the enemy often uses distraction and deceit to divert us from God's purpose. Nehemiah's example encourages us to stay focused on the work that God has given us. What distractions in your life pulling you away from the God-given mission you have? So let's look at what he faces next. He's facing slander and false accusations from these people. Sanballat sends an open letter accusing Nehemiah of plotting a rebellion and declaring himself king, as told in 6 and 7. Nehemiah denies the accusations and he prays for strength. Once again, we see that trend over and over again throughout Nehemiah. He keeps going to God in prayer. What should he do? And when we face false accusations or slander, because eventually you will if you haven't recently, you see, our response should be rooted in truth and prayer, just like Nehemiah. Instead of getting defensive or retaliating, Nehemiah prayed and stayed focused. How do you respond to false accusations or when your character is attacked? Well, in chapter 6, verses 10 through 14, Nehemiah is then faced with an assassination plot. A prophet named Shemaiah urges him to hide in the temple for safety, but Nehemiah discerns that this was a trap to discredit him. Nehemiah refuses to sin by entering the temple unlawfully and recognizes that false prophets were hired to intimidate him. And this is something that I think applies to most of our lives. The enemy will sometimes use even religious figures to lead us astray. Discernment is crucial in determining what is truly from God. We need to be in God's scripture to know the truth from what is not true. And then we see the completion of the wall told in chapter 6, verses 15 through 19. Despite all the opposition, the wall is completed in 52 days. Once again, such a short time to complete this wall with non-skilled laborers, I think is just incredible, which astonishes the enemies of Israel, which astonishes me. This chapter concludes with continued warnings about Tobiah's influence throughout his connections within the Jewish nobility. So the application here is Nehemiah's perseverance led to the completion of the wall. Perseverance is key to finishing the work that God has given us. So what task has God called you to complete? So there are really 4 key themes and lessons throughout these last 2 chapters. First of all, we have leadership and justice. Nehemiah models a form of leadership that balances justice and compassion and action. He confronts wrongdoing, but also exemplifies a self-sacrificial attitude. You see, Christian leaders today must balance truth and integrity and love. And so do you as non-leaders sometimes. Number 2, discernment in opposition. We learn that both chapters emphasize the need for discernment, whether dealing with internal issues, like in chapter 5, or external attacks that we saw in chapter 6. Nehemiah relied on prayer and wisdom to navigate those challenges. Number 3, we need to have the power of prayer. We all have access to this. Nehemiah constantly turns to God in prayer, whether in moments of anger, opposition, or danger. His dependence on God is central to his success. And then lastly, we need to resist distraction like they did when finishing the wall. When we need to finish a task, we need to put away the distractions that are often so much around us. You see, Nehemiah's determination to complete the wall, despite various distractions and threats, serve as an encouragement to believers to stay focused on their divine calling. Have a great week.
Like and subscribe.